fantastic, and I'm so excited for you, and I hope you all have a lovely time this evening.
Now that the floor show is done, I'd like to introduce Gordon Van Gelder.
Usually started, I had to do something. Speaking of which, we have to give a big hand to everyone at Norwescon who's kept the presentations going for the last 3 years, especially for 2020 when it was a monumental effort to get the live streamed award done. So please thank everyone involved. Now, the award itself, as I think most of you know, excuse me, goes to the best paperback original work of science fiction published in the last year. And as you know, we've got the 6 nominees here. Sorry, I've got in the back of my head just recently an industry veteran, a longtime writer and editor who shall remain nameless, basically said to me that science fiction is dead. It died a few years ago, and really it's just the legs of the corpse are still kicking like the frog with electricity running through it. As you will see tonight or learn tonight from the readings, he is so obviously wrong when you look at the works that we have here. The breadth and depth of the science fiction that's coming out and being recognized by this award is just outstanding. Just my opinion, but this guy's wrong. Just to prove the point, we're going to have readings from all 6 of the nominees this year. So we'll get right into it. Oh, actually, sorry, before we get into it, I want to issue a blanket apology to anyone and everyone whose name or book title I get wrong. It's going to happen. It's not intentional. I apologize. I'm going to do my best, though. So, on that note, the first nominee this year is Arboreality.
In Tiangong, Noor passes over her hometown, Victoria, BC, every hour. If there's no cloud cover, she can find the familiar coastline, and for a moment, she can take in the whole range of her childhood and adolescence. Her mother's house and the road on which she learned to drive, first dates, excellent exam results, terrible disappointments. The park they hiked when she was 12, where during campouts she had seen the faint dot of the old ISS. All those experiences enclosed in such a tiny space, made even smaller when she looks over the edge of the earth and sees the rest of the universe beyond. Noor observes the milky gray streams that pour in a gyre across the North Pacific coast. It isn't the color that sets them apart, but their opacity among the otherwise luminous clouds. At night, she can see through the thin spots to long lines of red moving inexorably across the rainforests. That must be Portland, where her parents had lived before she was born. That is Vancouver. She'd flown from YVR on her way to Hong Kong and then Kazakhstan. A man sitting beside her on the flight had said, "It looks like Earthsea down there, all those green islands and the white breakers." She'd nodded, yes, surprised by how right he was. Then the sun had set and the dark void of the Pacific had unrolled around the curve of the earth, and she had tried to sleep sitting up in her cramped seat, but could not because Kazakhstan was waiting for her, and then who knew what. One morning in November, the 3rd month of her rotation, clouds part to reveal the blackened coastline. She thinks of hungry deer in the valleys, and a cougar crouched in the drip line of a burnt Douglas fir. She thinks of the sun overhead, a distant explosion that fuels them all, burning her shoulders the day she learned to swim at Sombrio Beach. She thinks of rain. Above Tiangong is a web of satellites, run by the billionaires who've collected in the climate havens of Detroit, Cincinnati, Toledo. Oceans climb the coasts and methane belches from the permafrost, but tech bros and their accomplices walk barefoot on native grasses that have been genetically modified to suit both drought and the inevitable summer downpours of the new Midwest. Beyond these refugia, much of the earth below her is dark. The following spring, Noor is back on Earth and working in the new headquarters in Cincinnati. In a photograph of the West Coast, she recognizes the fine, defiant scrim of green growing over the blackened scars. Those are fireweed and blackberries. Those are alder saplings and the re-emerging twigs of Gary oak. In the future, this history will be captured through numbers so large they are unimaginable, measured from far away and high above the earth. The hectares destroyed, the people who died and those displaced, the species lost, the rivers diverted. There will be maps recording the greatest extent of the burn, the way that we now see maps of the Roman Empire under Trajan. It will, Noor hopes, though she is not naturally hopeful, it will be a shadow from which will emerge transformed. But looking over the salt deserts in the middle of Australia and the locust clouds over North Africa, she is afraid.
Our second nominee this year is Widowland by C.J. Carey, published by Sourcebooks Landmark. And reading for her will be Meghan Lancaster.
Back in 1933, when the leader had come to power, degenerate books had been burned on pyres. Jubilant people danced as the evening air was lit with flakes of fire, and the words of Jews, Slavs, communists, liberals, homosexuals, Freemasons, Catholics, and every kind of subversive turned to ash. The English, however, prided themselves on doing things a little differently. Native academics and librarians winced at the melodrama of their mainland allies. Although the regulations stipulated an outright ban on all the same categories of books, these degenerate texts were not burned on public bonfires, but loaded into industrial incinerators. Teams of civil servants combed libraries and archives, professionally cleansing them of problematic texts and disposing of them hygienically. This wasn't the Middle Ages, and this was England after all. Actually, it might interest you to see this. Cruz pulled back a drawer of the desk, extracted a small volume, and held it up. It bore the title, Informationschaft GB, Gestapo Handbook for the Invasion of Britain. Ever heard of it? She shook her head. No, sir. Bit of museum piece now, but back in 1939, it was drawn up by the head of counterespionage, Walter Schellenberg, in the event that England might have to be forcibly invaded. That never happened, thank God, but this little book outlined detailed plans on establishing an occupation administration, how to run the economy, transport, language, and so on, who to arrest. He frowned and continued flipping through. Yes, here's what I was looking for. The Sonderfahndungslist GB, Special Wanted List, to be handed over to the Department 4B4 of the Central Reich Security Office. The arrest operations to be headed by Colonel Professor Dr. Franz Six, 2,820 people. Another list. The Alliance liked lists. There were lists for everything. Noel Coward, Vera Brittain, Aldous Huxley, J.B. Priestley, Sylvia Pankhurst, Stephen Spender, Rebecca West, Virginia Woolf. Have you heard of these characters? A couple, Rose said cautiously. Virginia Woolf? I don't think so. Me neither, nor Schellenberg either, I dare say. Crossing the office, he paused at the drinks trolley to pour himself a generous whiskey and gazed down at the Thames below. If I can speak to you frankly, the reason many of these reprobates featured on Schellenberg's list is because they wrote novels, and their novels are dangerous. Dangerous, sir? Sure, our protector believes that books are every bit as dangerous as bombs. Words are weapons, aren't they? They're a conduit for spreading propaganda against the alliance. Back in the beginning, as you know, we tackled this problem with a fairly blunt instrument. We banned them. He remained at the window, shoulders hunched, staring absently downward. Personally, I was never a fan of the broad brush approach, and nor, it now seems, is the protector. He prefers something a little more nuanced. Say what you like about him, although I advise you not to. Here he turned and gave her a wink. But the man's a genius. Is he? Without a doubt. Now recently, his people have been working on ways of addressing the woman question. I see. The whole woman question is a far-reaching issue, but the part that's landed in my inbox concerns fiction. Obviously, you know that novels portraying a subversive view of females are outlawed. Unruly women, those who challenge male authority, degenerate sexual preferences, all that. The whole woman question is a far-reaching issue, but the part that's landed in my inbox, oh, sorry, that's in there twice. So, degenerate sexual preferences, all that, yes. But we can't make all books illegal, can we? Can't we? He glanced sharply to check for insubordination, and Rose returned a polite gaze. No, we can't. Rosenberg accepts that there are some texts that cannot be banned. Famous novels, stories that are woven too deeply into the popular imagination. Unfortunately, a very high proportion of these novels are written by or about women. You must know what I'm talking about. Name one. Her mouth dried. Was this another trap? To name a famous title was to admit to having read it, or at the very least, having heard of it. I'm not sure. Come on now, Miss Ransom. I'm talking to you as an employee of the Culture Ministry. This is official business, not an interrogation. Nothing you say will go beyond these walls. Pride and Prejudice? Good example. Jane Austen, one of England's most cherished writers. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, am I right? From what I recall, everyone knows Lizzie Bennet and that annoying mother of hers. I read the novel as a teenager in English class, too many years ago. It didn't mean much to me then. It seemed a small domestic tale of social climbing centered around snobbery and various English gentlemen taking too long to make up their minds about their romantic affairs. Yes? It's a comedy of manners, I think. We did it in school. Precisely. But it's not until you reach adulthood that you appreciate what Miss Austen has to say. She's saying that Elizabeth Bennet is intelligent, yes? That marriage can subject women to degradation, that masculine superiority should be questioned. That never occurred to me. Cruz came toward her, perching on the edge of the desk so that they were uncomfortably close. The thing is, Rose, if I may call you Rose, we can't just erase Pride and Prejudice, or Middlemarch, or Jane Eyre, or any of those novels. They're too famous. They're ingrained in the culture. Cleansing them from popular consciousness will take a generation, but we can do something about them now. His voice was low and confidential, as though they were caught up in an enterprise that involved just the two of them, a personal conspiracy. I can't take credit for this. It's Rosenberg who had the idea. He says far better than destroying these books is to correct them, to edit them. Edit them? Classic texts? Updating is the word he uses, but nothing irrational about it. Scientists update their theories as new discoveries are made. When Copernicus discovered that the Earth moved around the sun, everyone had to adjust their textbooks, didn't they? Map makers correct their charts every time a new island turns up. Are you saying they're wrong? No, but so why not novels? It's just, it would be a huge enterprise to rewrite the classics. I agree, and no one's suggesting that. What's required is something far more subtle, an adjustment of ideology, an abridgment, really, a slight minor correction to some characters and themes. What do you mean correction? I mean that books, like people, need discipline. Not only the discipline of grammar and sentences, but the hard discipline of meaning. She steeled herself to maintain eye contact. So I'm talking about excision, rephrasing, carving out the rotten and diseased meanings and subversive suggestions that trigger disturbing thoughts and infect young minds. The necrotic attitudes that have the potential to rot an entire nation, shaping books like the sculptor shapes stone. The way Martin Cruz put it, it sounded almost like art. How would one know what's subversive? He smiled, mock stern. Well, Miss Ransom, I might say a citizen of the Protectorate should have the correct attitudes written on her heart, but I won't insult you. Let's just say I can see that you're intelligent. But if there was a specific issue of ideology, in that case, I suppose you should ask yourself the question that every culture ministry employee should ask themselves. He waited, eyebrows raised, for the answer. And when none came, he supplied it himself. What would Minister Goebbels do?
Let's see, our third nominee this year is Ymir by Rich Larson, published by Orbit. And Rich couldn't be here. Reading for him is Yang Wang.
Testing, testing. I just want to start off with a small note that, I'm not Rich, and poor Rich, he had his book cover knocked down, and now he has a reader that's looked up the name of this title and how to pronounce it, and the internet has told me 4 different ways, so I'm just going to go with one. So please be gentle with me if you disagree. Thank you. Chapter 1. Yorick wakes up dead, which is never comfortable. His chest is a clamp, lungs frozen, no heartbeat. His limbs are phantom. The hide-brained panic swallows him whole. He knows nothing except that he is alone and terrified and in the dark. Every sensory-starved nerve in his body is screaming it. And then, a jolt of electricity digs its teeth in, and his heart stutters back into motion. He owns his chest muscles again, so he sucks down a breath, ballooning all the crumpled alveoli in his lungs. The first one always feels like sucking back broken glass. A rehearsed thought comes to him. Nothing is wrong. You're coming out of torpor. Nothing is wrong. You're coming out of torpor. He gasps, bucks, waits for the firestorm in his nervous system to subside, for the world to stop lurching from side to side. He works on proprioception, finding his body in space. His arms and legs are spread-eagled, punctured in a dozen places by tubes that are pumping him full of newly brewed blood. A diagnostic droid is scuttling up and down his torso. His prosthetic mandible is missing. Cold, dry air rasps in his wound. Welcome back from the river Styx, Yorick. Yorick's eyes are crusted over. He works his lids until he manages to free one from the ground. First, he sees only a dark gray haze. Next, he sees an orange blur flickering through his field of vision too quickly to track. He knows from experience that this is the orange suit of a thaw technician. It's been a long time since we last spoke, the voice says. Nearly 2 decades here, half that for you, I believe, with all the time spent in torpor. I can see you've done good work in that span. 8 successful hunts. Did they ever permit you to keep trophies from them? Yorick knows the voice. His gut coils tight. I still think you did your very best work out here with me, of course, the voice continues. Back in those early days of subjugation. That tattoo on his neck prickles. He knows the voice, but it was one he never thought he would hear again. And if he's hearing it again, then that means... I'm afraid this thaw is not taking place on Munnin. You were rerouted in transit to solve a more pressing problem here on Ymir. No, fucking no! That seems to have spiked your adrenals, Yorick. Thrilled to be home, I expect. Memories crash in. phosphorescent flares lighting up the ice field, the skull-pulping sound of smart mines going off, an anonymous body shredded to pieces, steaming, another barely intact, wriggling through the snow and slicking blood behind. And the owner of the voice is there, too, one bony hand on his shoulder, saying, "Civilization costs." "I'm an administrator here now," Gosta says, voice sintered with faint surprise, as if she's still marveling at the fact. "Living just to the east of your old haunts, overseeing security for all of Ymir's Northern Hemisphere extraction and refinery sites. Which brings us to why you're here." Yorick wants to rage, to beg, to say that he will go anywhere, absolutely anywhere. Just not Ymir. The splush ball of piss on the edge of the colony maps. The birthplace he swore to never set foot on again. But he can't speak without his mandible. He only manages an animal groan that startles the thaw technician. 8 days ago, yeah, like that. 8 days ago, a xenotech incident suspended all labor in the Polar 7 mine, Gosta continues. There were Grendels here after all, and we finally dug far enough to wake one up. Yorick isn't afraid of the Grendel. He's killed the Grendel 12 times on 12 worlds. It's the job the company trained him for. He's afraid of everything else. It butchered a few miners and then disappeared, as a Grendel is wont to do, Gosta says. But the attack has reinvigorated anti-company sentiment here in the north. There are rumors of a strike, fainter rumors of an insurrection. We tread on thin ice. Yorick finally pries his other eye open. The orange blob of the technician sharpens. Above it, he sees the hazy outline of a hollow projected on a low plaster ceiling. He can't make out Dame Gausta's features, but he recognizes the predatory angles of her body. He remembers her in a cam suit, her long limbs dissolving into the ashy snow behind her, her hooded head turning dark at the starless sky. Before that, in a bright yellow coat. "The algorithm balked when I chose you for this job, Yorick," Gausta says. "You were the only third nearest option, and the differential in transit cost was significant." Yorick forces the memories down and works on focusing his eyes. Gausta's face becomes clear, the wolfish gaze and jutted bones and swirled vitiligo skin. She's aged less than he has in twice the years, as perfect and awful as ever. The engineered telomeres of a company higher up at work. Her eyes are unchanged, the same silvery pits. But machine minds are so limited when it comes to socio-historic context. Gausta gives her scalpel smile. "You understand this place, Yorick. Every day the mine remains shut and the Grendel roams free. Not only does the company bleed profit, but the locals' discontent festers. Stability degrades. But it will never be stable up here." Yorick wants to scream it at her. The first colonists to come to Ymir were exiles and radicals. The generations born after were shaped by the cold and the dark into paranoid tribalists. He left because he didn't want to die. And now, the company has returned him with a tattoo on his neck and a target on his back. Gausta reads his ruined face, or more likely, his jolting heartbeat. "It's been 20 years here," she says, "and you've undergone quite a spectacular rendering of flesh. Nobody will recognize you, Yorick, so long as you do your work quickly and tread lightly on the ice." Thank you.
Our next nominee is January 15th by Rachel Swirsky, published by Tor.com. And reading for Rachel Swirsky is Rachel Swirsky.
Somewhere around Revere Park, one of Janelle Butler's buzz cams started acting up. The thing was finicky about the cold. It was supposed to be top-notch, But Janelle hadn't found any difference between brands. Top or bottom dollar, freelance reporters got screwed. She didn't need this. January was bad enough with the endless demands from news aggregators asking for the same repetitive, universal basic income stories. It had been interesting to go around and ask the man, woman, and child on the street how they felt about UBI when the program started. Since then, they'd just been sending freelancers to wear out the same interviews someone else had already worn better. She felt like a bee doing the same mindless task year after year, just like all the other bees. Get the honey, do a dance, interview someone who thinks her cats should get UBI, interview a violinist who uses their money to fund lessons for disadvantaged kids, interview a new mom about the savings fund she set aside for her baby, interview a lawyer representing a class action lawsuit against a landlord for extorting his tenants' disbursements. Interview a senior citizen who lost his home because of problems with the transition from Social Security. Interview the protesters, wherever they are this year. Interview the protesters protesting the other protesters, wherever they are this year. Her favorite one ever had been interview an ex-con who spent her UBI to buy land and a trailer so she can live off the grid and make truly terrible pots. Interesting, specific, quirky. Of course, that had been the first year, and also, of course, none of the aggregators wanted a follow-up. Janelle and Dynasty had clicked, though, and still talked socially every year on UBI Day. So, hey, her job had been good for something. At least once. It occurred to Janelle, not for the first time, that the aggregators would probably love to run her story too if she wedged it into the right box. Sentimental, Chicago-based 28-year-old raises 14-year-old sister after parents die in plane crash. Political, former activist relies on legislation she championed to care for orphaned sibling. Socially responsible, UBI keeps Black families together. Anyway, the upshot was there was always work for 2 weeks in January, even if you didn't have a great relationship with the major aggregators. A lot of the year was hit or miss. UBI stories were a pillar of her income. So, of course, one of her buzz cams was broken. Thank you.
Thank you. The fifth nominee this year is The Legacy of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson, published by Tor.com. And reading for Tade is Dawn Shaw.
Our name is Tamara Koyosho, and we are many. Right now, there are 17 of us, though we're getting that itch in the base of our brain. That means number 18 is most likely coming soon. We are at present spread over a 2-mile radius, mostly in Milton Keynes. We are accountants, road workers, occupational therapists, admin managers, childminders, surgeons, police officers, taxi drivers, retail workers, cleaners, call center workers, salespeople, and unemployed. We are all that. When we sit on a park bench in Willen Lake a few minutes after midnight, we are not surprised when Vitaly Ignatievich shuffles up and sits next to one of us. It may well be that Vitaly knows more about us than we do ourselves. Seeing him often means trouble. Tamara, he says. Vitaly, we say. You've been difficult to find. We've been busy living, Vitaly. He nods. He is bearded, older man, Russian, but been around England and Wales for years now. The world has shown its disdain for this kind of warrior, and the effect is obvious. The fabric of his clothes is unraveling, his shoes tired and on the verge of collapse, the tobacco he rolls, cheap. How was Japan? I heard. The 100-man is not for a woman. It was Samoa, and it will be. Perhaps. Tell me, Tamara, have you seen Molly? He says it casually, as if that's not been the only thing on his mind. The last time we heard from Molly Southbourne, it was a phone message, and it scared us out of our fucking clothes. You know who this is. You also know by now that I know all of your plans, and I want no part of them. If you let this go, I will, and we can all get what we want. If you try to follow me or impede me in any way, I promise you I will murder you all. Test me and see. We had and have no desire to test her. We had an idea she went south. We moved in the opposite direction. No, we say, and fuck you for bringing it up. We need a Molly Southbourne, Tamara. We don't need anything. You and we have no common cause, Vitali. You owe me. We do not. All right, let me say this another way, Tamara Colioso. I have helped you. I am asking for your help. With what? Like I say, we need a Molly Southbourne. We need to get one of her out of the country. Help me in this, and we will part ways forever. No. You will pay us, because someone is paying you for this service. Does it look like I am in a position to pay anyone, Tamara Colioso? Does it look like we care? We get up and walk away from him, knowing it is not the last time we will see him, knowing that this is just an opening gambit. Already, though, we begin to plan, theoretically, how we might subdue Molly Southbourne. In some scenarios, she lives. In others, she dies. In all of them, the cost to us is great. If you try to follow me or impede me in any way, I promise you, I will murder you all. Test me and see. All. The wise thing might be to run. Tamara, says Vitali from behind us. We turn. I'll pay you. We nod. The Molly can't be injured. Unconscious is fine, but no brain damage, no cuts. It can't be burned or otherwise traumatized. What about the watchers? OBS 16. We are mindful that the organization is looking for us and others like us. Then we are in business. That will not be a problem, trust me on this. Then we are in business. We sit back down to talk money and terms. We wonder who he represents. But if it's a foreign power, it's likely to be Russia. They say the USSR is gone. Tamara knows that governments come and governments go, but intelligence agencies abide. They just change uniform.
Thank you. The sixth, when I was in school as a Van Gelder, I got used to being the last person called except for Jamie Zampino. I just bring that up to point out that the order of the books has been in alphabetical by the author's last name, which brings us to the sixth nominee this year, The Extractionist by Kimberly Unger. Kimberly?
empty place on the bookstore bookshelves. There are no other sci-fi authors with the last name that begins with U. So, Blue Ocean, baby! We're gonna fill that up. Hey folks, I'm Kimberly Unger. I wrote this, and I'm gonna read it to you. Thank you. Eliza New Ray, Winona McKay, could have sworn that the red warning triangle on the side of the cup wasn't flashing a minute ago, but you could never tell with cheap paper circuits. They failed just as often as they worked. McKay was in Singapore to meet with a potential client. A reference from an old friend, a message through a cheap, secure service, and a meeting location delivered via a self-destruct messenger all suggested inexperience and overkill. In McKay's line of work, discretion was standard. Nobody ever wanted to admit a boss or a family member had gotten themselves trapped in a virtual world. Still, the reference had come from a colleague she respected, and it had been years since she'd spent quality time in the Lion City, so she'd made the trip. Finally, McKay took a too eager sip of coffee and promptly drenched the table as she tried to spit the scalding mouthful back through the lid. She shoved her chair back just in time to avoid getting the coffee all over her lap. The surge in movement kicked the overlay into gear, clouding McKay's vision with data on everything. The temperature of the air, the coffee, the chair she was about to trip over, the distance from and the mass of the table, as well as information on the coffee shop's history, advertisements, local alerts, and police systems. The coup de grace was a pop-up that obscured her last sliver of normal vision to inform her of the client's arrival. So much for looking cool and collected. McKay spun the computer in her head back down into sleep, restoring her normal line of sight. The overlay and emotive AI that ran the computer systems wired into her skull was at her disposal on a moment's notice. They just sometimes disagreed on what those moments should be. It took McKay a moment to register the woman standing across the dripping bistro table with a helpful handful of napkins. The woman was probably taller than McKay, even without the heels. A catastrophically red twist of hair and a teal-blue overcoat meant she stood out in a crowd. Not what you'd expect from someone trying to stay under the radar, but that might be the point. The overlay slid one last reminder into McKay's field of view, telling her that the meeting was about to start. Yes, McKay answered awkwardly. She took half the offered salvation, and between the two of them, the table was mopped and righted in a moment. Sorry, she continued, the coffee had a real kick. One of the ever-present Voomer robots bumped insistently against her shoe until McKay dropped the sodden napkins into its wide-open maw. The blue enamel paint on its leading edge was scarred from the overeager pursuit of dropped trash, and probably from the boots of a few local kids as well. McKay suppressed a flash of irritation at the idea of its casual mistreatment as it scooted away, burbling delightedly to itself in the satisfied tones coded into service robots everywhere. It must be a Monday, the woman opposite McKay said conversationally, and then took a seat without being asked. I nearly took a caffeine shower on the MRT on the way here. The smile she offered was more along the lines of, I know how you feel, than, my, what an idiot, which suggested that McKay had kept a touch of professionalism intact. The overlay did its job and told McKay the client wasn't carrying one of the encoded MRT passes on her person, suggesting she was lying. You could still buy a plastic pass at the train station. The overlay might not see it, but McKay's personal AI tended to deal in absolutes. It was her job to interpret the results. Lying to conceal how she got here, making conversation, setting up a backstory. The other woman displayed none of the nervousness that usually came with an inexperienced client. It suggested the roundabout connection hadn't been overkill at all. She was a professional of some sort. Guns, information, the silver needle of political intrigue. McKay wasn't sure just yet. She was reluctant to risk the distraction of a background check during a client meeting, despite the overlay's eagerness to get on the job. McKay asked the overlay to stay in the background so she could focus on her own assessment. Already, this woman was throwing up contradictions that suggested this wasn't a run-of-the-mill assignment. No freckles, eyes entirely human, and green to boot. Can I get you something, Miss McKay paused for the other woman to fill in the name, but the woman's attention was elsewhere, rummaging around in a handbag that McKay hadn't noticed a few seconds ago. It was the risk of keeping the AI in the background. The human mind could get distracted, it could miss things. The overlay could have provided the information in the space between eye blinks, but the human connection, was critical to her work. McKay sometimes had to remind herself of that. Unfortunately, Ms. McKay, I am already short on time this morning. I'm part of a group that specializes in the abuse of two technologies. She casually touched a spot on her neck as she rummaged, just below and behind the ear. Her casual competence, the matter-of-factness, affected a good 10-foot radius around her. I need an extraction done here in the city. She paused and her eyes narrowed a fraction as something McKay couldn't hear got her attention. Excuse me, I think we're going to have to reschedule. McKay had just parted her lips to reply when she felt the all-over kiss of something very powerful charging up via the might line that connected all the computers in her body. She recognized the feeling and had to stamp out the panic that threatened to follow. The woman's green eyes met hers, and everything about her expression told McKay to avoid what was coming next. As if it had been rehearsed, they both got up from the table smoothly and headed in opposite directions. They each walked quickly, but not too quickly. McKay was already locking everything down in her head, making sure the overlay was off, not just spun down, but off. In a city like Singapore, it wasn't guns and bombs you had to worry about. Any attack would be digital, virtual. It would come from a place where Eliza McKay was uniquely exposed. An EM pulse could wreck every component in her head, and nobody else in the room would have a problem. She briefly weighed the risk of jail time for jaywalking against the cost of repairing her own internal computers, but the light was in her favor. McKay hit the far side of the crosswalk just as the EMP went off in the coffee shop. No sound, no explosion, just the unearthly silence of electrical death.
Nominees and all the readers, thank you. Now, you guys are probably wondering just how the awards are decided. And before, when we had a show of hands, were there 2 people here who have read all 6 books? Could you guys come up? You guys can decide the award. Okay, actually, the work has already been done by this year's judges, who were Michael Cassett, Matthew Goodwin, Stina Light, and Elise Tobler. And they spent all year reading eligible books, arguing about them, agreeing, disagreeing, going back and forth, and finally settling on their choice for the winner and runner-up. After which, this is much more than most people care to know, but the final results go to the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society, come here to Norwescon, and go to the Philip K. Dick Trust, all of whom have a say in the whole process, and all of whom have been very generous in their sponsorship and support of the award. I guess I don't need to delay it any further. The special citation this year goes to The Legacy of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson. Obviously, Tade is not here, but we will make sure that he gets this. And there is no trophy to go with the award, but there is a very nice cash prize, which will be sent to him in due course. Which brings us to the winner. This year's award for this year's Philip K. Dick Award goes to The Extractionist by Kimberly Unger.
I don't know if I'm supposed to like say a few words or something, but holy macaroni, this is awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And that's about a wrap. We'll be doing this again in a year. So thank you everyone for coming out, and like I said, we'll be back in 12 months.